All right, we're looking at the matter of family relationships. Family relationships. And there are so many various dynamics, and that's a really big umbrella. Family relationships is a huge umbrella. I mean, because we could be talking about relationships between husbands and wives. We could be talking about relationships between fathers and children, mothers and children, aging parents. I mean, there are just so many dynamics that are involved in the idea of a study of family relationships. But this one begins with the simple matter of marriage. And when I say simple, I mean singular matter of marriage. And the Bible is clear that marriage is intended to be for as long as both are alive. And that has always been God's plan. When Jesus was asked about marriage in Matthew chapter 19, actually he was asked about divorce, and he went all the way back to the Garden of Eden and when I say reestablished, he reaffirmed God's plan for marriage. Man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. And that's God's plan for marriage. God's plan for marriage has not changed. Even in the law of Moses, though divorce was permitted and in some circumstances under the law of Moses, which eventually began, much like in today's society, with a lot of different ideas about what constituted uncleanness there in Deuteronomy 24. God's plan for marriage was still one man, one woman for life. And then the New Testament affirms that in Matthew 19, and it also affirms it here in the opening paragraph in Romans chapter 7, where it speaks of, he says, let's just read verses, Romans 7, 2 and 3. Now, the interesting thing about this text is it's not teaching us, or it's not designed to teach about marriage. It's simply using marriage as a reference point to teach about the law of Moses and the relationship that we have now with Jesus Christ. And I wish so many people in the religious world would understand these verses as they were intended, all right? But the reference point is marriage. It says, the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives, she marries another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has been married to another man. Now, Paul's just making this as a blanket statement of fact, okay? Then in verse 4, he applies this principle to the Jews' relationship to the law of Moses. In that formerly you were married to Moses through the law, but now that law is dead so that you can be joined to Christ. I mean, that's the whole point of verses 4, 5, 6, and following. But the standard is one man, one woman for life. That's the foundational principle that Paul is using to teach that the old law and the 10 Commandments are dead. They are like a dead husband, he describes them, so that you don't have to feel guilty about your relationship as a Christian and abandoning your first husband. He says, because your first husband is dead. The law of Moses is dead. And we know that law includes the 10 Commandments, because in verse number 7, he said, I would have not known sin except for the law. He says, for the law, I would have not known covetousness except that the law said, thou shalt not covet. You say, well, what's the significance of that? Well, this is the same law in verse This is the same law in verse 7 that is described as a dead husband in verses 1 through 3. And the only place in the old law that says thou shalt not covet is where? In the Ten Commandments. It's one of the Ten Commandments. So in quoting thou shalt not covet, Paul includes the Ten Commandments as part of that law that was dead. Okay? But I'm chasing that rabbit just because, well, number one, because it's something that we all need to be reminded of. This can be one of our go-to passages when people want to talk about still keeping the Ten Commandments. I had a long discussion about this 2 weeks ago in my Bible study at the country place, because we're studying Hebrews. And we have the same study at the high rise, and we talked about the Ten Commandments. They're dead. And it just blows people's mind when you say things like that. But this text teaches it. But it's teaching it in the context of God's plan for marriage. And so, let me get this out of the way so I can see the rest of the book here. And then it says, specific instructions are given to husbands and wives concerning, number one, their conjugal duties. That's in 1 Corinthians 7. 1 through 5, that various renderings will say, that the husband is to render due benevolence to his wife, and the wife is to render due benevolence to her husband. In other words, it is a sin to withhold the marriage bed from your spouse. It is a sin to withhold the marriage bed from your spouse. Hebrews 13 and verse 4. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed is undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. By the way, speaking of this particular thing, and I know it makes people nervous when you start talking about sex, but the Bible talks about it. I mean, that's what the Bible is talking about. I heard at one time that the Roman Church didn't want the book of Song of Solomon read in the assemblies because they thought it was too risque. But the Bible talks about these things, and so I heard this, and I've heard it in more than one context, and that is that 25% of all marriages are described as sexless marriages. Sexless marriages. All right, now by definition, the idea of a sexless marriage is where the couple comes together one or fewer times a month. One or fewer times a month. And just look, speaking from 35 years in ministry, that number does not surprise me. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard, and by the way, and it's mostly men who are the victims of this. Mostly men. But I have known situations. Been told. Not that I'm asking. People are telling me these things. That I know of at least 3 specific times when a wife was telling me that her husband was withholding himself from her. But the vast majority are the other way around. But the Bible condemns that. God's intent for husband. Now, look, I'm not talking about situations where there might be some type of medical issue. I'm talking about in the normal course. And by the way, of all the instances that have been brought to my attention specifically, these are all people in their 30s and 40s and 50s. In other words, this is not a matter of people who have medical issues. I'm not talking about 90-year-olds. All right, I'm talking about people that are young and healthy and should enjoy a healthy sex life, and they don't because one partner has withheld themselves from the other. And so, that was never God. That's not God's intent. That's what 1 Corinthians 7:1-5. I mean, Paul says it specifically. And he also says that a healthy sex life is a guard against fornication. Because in my dealings, a lot of times I've also heard or seen where one has withheld from the other, and then the other one ends up being tempted and ends up committing adultery because of that situation. And so these are not uncommon situations. All right, they are not uncommon at all. And so I just kind of wanted to. I mean, the lesson started there, so I wanted to expand on this because a lot of times this is something that a lot of times just gets glossed over. And then also in the paragraph, husbands and wives are commanded by God to love one another. Ephesians 5 specifically emphasizes the love of a husband for his wife, and not only is it commanded, but there is a standard. It says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her." Husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. I mean, over and over and over again, we find the admonition of husbands to love their wives, and there is a standard set there. All right, the primary admonition given to wives in loving their husbands is to be submissive to them. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Do you see here again how the relationship of the Lord enters into this picture? And so we have husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Wives are to submit themselves to their own husbands as unto the Lord. And so we have this standard that we all ought to desire to achieve in loving one another in our marriages. And and sometimes I think we get deceived because we think about the broader context of husbands loving their wives, and we forget about the details that are involved in that. We talk in broad terms about husbands loving their wives, and husbands talk about loving their wives. But the truth of the matter is, husbands that beat their wives will tell you they love their wives. Right? I mean, they will tell you they love their wives, even though they physically abuse their wives. Husbands that continually run down their wives, belittle their wives. Speak ill to and of their wives. You know what they're going to tell you? They're going to tell you they love their wives. All right? And by the way, these are really egregious situations, okay? But there are other things that also go into that. Again, the details. If your wife asks you or needs you to do something, are you willing? If it calls for it, are you willing to drop whatever it is that you're doing and go do it? The joke. One of the jokes I told at the marriage retreat one year says, "Now listen, wives," said, if you ask your husband to do something, said, don't be nagging him for 6 or 7 months about it. He will get it done. And just let that settle in for a second. But that is sometimes the case, right? We say that we'll do a thing, and 6 months later it's still not done, or a year later it's still not done. Another example that I use sometimes, especially in those contexts, is a husband says that he would die for his wife, but he won't pick up his dirty socks. No, it's easy to talk in the abstract. It's easy to talk, in the broad platitudes, But if you leave your stuff laying around and you know it bothers your wife, you know what you need to do? Stop leaving it laying around. Now, I'm glad Rhonda left. Because the first thing she's going to tell you is to go look at Todd's office. Now, my office looks like a tornado hit it. And it does, but I know where everything is. And if she went in there and tried to clean it up, I could never find anything. My office is, here, she came back. She came back. All right, let's go on to a different subject. What?
I don't know how he can find anything. And Drew, I didn't get with you. We need to get a door in that office. That office is a train wreck.
I've already admitted all that. All right, so I'm in the clear, but I know where everything is. All right. So, but the idea of truly loving our spouse is not found in the broad platitudes. It's found in the details of living every single day, and what we do every single day. And I would never presume to speak to, for example, any of our widows or widowers, but although I could ask, when you lost your spouse, were there things besides them? Were there things that they did that you miss? Little things. Were there little things that they did for you, maybe every day or every week, or on a regular? Or there are things that they did that you miss. All right? But now let me ask you this, and I'm not trying to shame you. I said, but did you think about those little things while they were actually going on? Or were they just a part of everyday life? And then you realize now those things are gone, but it also helps us to appreciate. You think back and then you can appreciate. It's like, I thought, I believed my husband loved me, or I believed my wife loved me, but now I'm able to look, now that they're gone, I'm able to see things that don't get done, that used to get done, that I didn't think about, and maybe things they didn't have to do. And now I was like, I really have a better understanding about how much my spouse loved me. And so what I would encourage those of us that still have our spouses is do those things. Do those things. Loving your husband, loving your wife is found in the details. All right. We're still in the first paragraph. Once married, people do not have an option whether to make the marriage successful or not. In other words, when we enter into marriage, we enter into a covenant with one another, but most importantly, we enter into a covenant with God. When I do wedding ceremonies, when I do the vows part, I say, do you swear or do you promise before God and these witnesses? I always want to remind, look, and most of the weddings that I do are people from church that know these things, but a lot of times I'll do a wedding, like I just realized, Rhonda, I didn't realize that Molly and Spencer got married on our anniversary. Joni posted it on our anniversary. Oh, anniversary week. Okay. I couldn't imagine driving to Dexter and doing a wedding on my anniversary, but most of the time I'm going to polishing the pulpit on our anniversary. So that's just the way that works out. But in that ceremony, man, there were hundreds of people there. Hundreds. I mean, that Dexter church building looked full. And then, it's a big building. It looked kind of like Hamilton's building. So when I'm doing a wedding ceremony, I'm not just talking to the two people that are standing in front of me. I'm talking to everybody in that audience and reminding them that this relationship, with respect to whatever state we're in and however the laws are conducted, this relationship is recognized by God. And both parties have a responsibility to honor God in that relationship. You know, the home, and when I say the home, I mean husbands and wives. The home is the very fabric of our society. You know, everything that makes a country successful ultimately comes back to whether or not the homes are successful. If the home is destroyed, the schools are going to be a wreck. If the home is destroyed, our communities are going to be a wreck. If the home is destroyed, our governmental leadership is going to be a wreck. So really strengthening our nation is not about strengthening our military or voting the right people into office. It's really about strengthening the home. If we want America to be great, then America has to have great homes. Because guns are no substitute. Weaponry is no substitute for the home. And so it behooves every single one of us, that are married, to make our homes the very best that they can be. And for any who may have lost a spouse, use your experience to help the rest of us make our home what it should be. Titus chapter 2 talks about older women teaching the younger women. And you know what one of the things they're told to teach younger women? To love their husbands. What young married woman would think that she doesn't love her husband? And yet the Bible says older women are to teach younger women how, not just how, but to love their husbands, showing them really how to love their husbands, how to be, keepers of the home. And so, there's a vast resource that even small congregations like this have, where, those that are older can help teach and instruct those of us that are younger. All right, on page 60, the second paragraph says, the husband is placed by God to be the head of the family. Back in the day, Harry Truman had a placard on his office, in the Oval Office on his desk. Does anybody remember what it said? That's right, the buck stops here. The buck stops here. All right? The success of the home ultimately resides with the husband. The buck stops here. And that's the way God intended for it to be. Now, does it always work out that way? No, it doesn't always work out that way. As someone who was essentially raised in a single parent home, I can tell you it doesn't always work that way. In my case, the buck stopped with my mother. And I was fortunate beyond words, to live in my hometown, with both sets of grandparents, especially my mother's parents, with my grandpa Burleson, and to have a strong positive, godly male influence in my life. But not all young people are blessed like that. They're not blessed like that. Sometimes things go awry, and we have to we do the best. We do the best with what we got. And if what we have is less than the divine ideal, then God wants us to do the best. He wants us to do the best with what we got. But men, the responsibility, the success of the home ultimately rests with the man. That means the financial stability of the home rests with the man. Look, you can't spend too much money. All right. Secondly, you can't let your wife spend too much money. And again, most of the time, but not nearly as much as in my first example, most of the time the too much spending part is not on the husband's side. It's not on the husband. Look, if it were, then all the jokes wouldn't be about wives spending too much money. In other words, I realize it's comedy, but comedy is always at least rooted in truth. Again, but not always. But not always. It's the husband's responsibility to make sure that the home is financially stable and secure. I'm not talking about being rich. I'm not talking about having a lot of things. It means making sure that things go right from day to day. Now, ultimately, in most cases, the minutiae of that, the details of that, rest with the wife. That's why Titus 2 talks about wives being keepers of the home. Rhonda and I, and it's a lot different now than it used to be. We can get our bills set up and you never write a check for them. But when Rhonda and I were first married, every bill had to have a check written, right? There was no such thing as the internet and auto draft and all of those things. It makes things a lot easier now to make sure that you don't end up, in arrears on any of your finances. But there are still other things where money can go out without much thought, and those are the types of things that get families in financial difficulty. Most financial difficulties are not due to a lack of income; it's to an excess of spending. That's just the way that it works out. But it's the husband's job. All right? It's the husband's job to make sure, ultimately, that children are disciplined. But once again, how does it work out in the day-to-day? Even when my dad was still living at home, you know who gave me the biggest majority of my whoopings? It was the woman that was with me all day. Right? My mom stayed at home while my dad went to work, and my mom busted my tail. By the way, I'll just tell you right now, in my memory, in my actual memory, I'll bet you my dad didn't whip me 10 times in fact, I probably can't even remember more than about 3 or 4 times that my dad whipped me. My mom, of course, obviously my mom raised me as a single parent, even when she was married a lot of the time. But man, my mom pulled my tail. When Dad wasn't around, and she was, it was her. But again, ultimately, it was my dad's responsibility to make sure that my mom beat my tail when I needed it. By the way, I know it happens. I don't think it's fair. Wait till your dad gets home is not a good form of discipline. And here's why. Because if a guy's been at work all day and he comes in and he's beat down, the last thing he wants to do when he comes through the door, first thing is whoop his kids. Now, he may need to, as the situation arises. It might be the case that Mama whoops him and then Daddy comes and he needs to whoop him too, because she might not have done a very good job. But it's not fair. I don't think it's fair to hang that. I don't think it's fair. But it's still the husband's responsibility to make sure that the house is orderly, kept in order. Next paragraph: children must be taught to respect and obey their parents. Respect and obey their parents. I don't know how many of you think about this. But when parents discipline their children, and when parents demand respect from their children, and when parents demand obedience from their children, what they're actually helping them do is go to heaven. Because when kids are small, when kids are small, we can teach them about God, right? But God's really an abstract kind of thought, right? But what's the number one? Picture of God? Father, right? The number one picture of God in the Bible is Father. So, as we're rearing our children, we're teaching them not about their earthly father, but about their heavenly Father. Because, does God demand us to respect Him? He does. Does God expect us to obey Him? He does. Are there harsh penalties for failing to do so? Yes, there are. And I'm not even talking about the bad one at the end of time at the judgment. You know, when children don't respect their fathers and they don't respect God, their lives are going to be hard. Their lives are going to be hard. You know, they're going to be mixed up in all kinds of foolishness. They're going to be in trouble. You know, they're going to be a menace to society. So when we're raising our children to respect and obey their father, we're really teaching them to respect and obey their heavenly Father. When they get old enough to start thinking about these things, they have a concept of what it means to respect God. They have a concept of what it means to obey God, right? And so, as we raise them up in the nurture and the admonition. Nurture is to help them grow, and admonition is the structure. I've oftentimes referred to it, that raising children is like growing tomatoes. It's like growing tomatoes. They have to have certain, the soil has to be right, and the water has to be right, and the fertilizer has to be right. Is that right? All those things are correct. But you don't just plant a tomato and provide it all those things and then just let it run, right? What happens? It starts setting fruit and branches break, or the fruit touches the ground while it's growing, and what happens? Then the fruit ends up being rotten. It's no good. So you've provided the nurture, but the admonition is the structure. You stake that tomato, or you put a cage around it, and then it provides the structure. So it's the nurture and the admonition that allows a tomato to grow the way that God intended it to grow and produce the fruit that God intended it to produce. And then there's one more thing that's really important about growing tomatoes, and that's pinching the suckers out of them. If you've ever grown tomatoes, you know what I'm talking about. You have the main stalk, and then you have the branches that come off the stalk, and then you'll see a leaf start growing out of the crook in that stalk. And if you leave that thing alone, another little stem will grow out of that. Well, guess what? That stem is not going to produce fruit. All it's going to do is suck water and nutrients away from the main part of the plant. So you talk about suckering your tomatoes. At least once a week, you got to go around and you just pinch them out with your finger. If it's a leaf, just pinch it out. If it got to a stem, just pinch it out. And it won't grow back. It won't grow back. Well, our kids are like that. We can provide the nurture, we can provide the admonition, but along the way, we got to pinch the suckers out of them. The things that will grow out of them that won't help them, but will only drag them down and will hinder them from being everything that. Look, you can get tomatoes out of an unsuckered plant. I'm not saying you can't. But you get the most fruit and the best fruit from a plant that's been maintained, you see. And so raising children's a lot like raising tomatoes in kind of in a general way, as the way the Bible describes it. I tell you what, I want to just go ahead and stop right there. I want to come back to this because we really need to spend more time talking about our families than just 1 week. So I want to pick back up at the bottom of page 60 next week. Ma'am?